Good evening. He was famously the Soviet leader Margaret Thatcher said she could do business with. Well, tonight there is the sad news from Moscow that former President Mikhail Gorbachev, who reframed the East's relationship with the West, has died at the age of 81. He was the youngest and the last leader of the Soviet Union who forged arms reduction deals with America's President Reagan and ended what became known as the Cold War without bloodshed. When the fall of the Berlin Wall followed, he couldn't stop the breakup of the Soviet Union, refusing to use the might of the Soviet army against republics along its border with Europe, wanting to split from Moscow. Reports from Moscow say he died today after a serious and a long illness. The impact of his legacy is tonight being felt around the world.
The man who ended the Cold War, who peacefully relinquished Soviet control of Eastern Europe, who ultimately presided over the breakup of the Soviet Union itself. Mikhail Gorbachev's place in the history of the 20th century is secure. His legacy still with us in the international order we live under today. Few men or women have ever had such an impact on their time. The great irony is that the man who would break the Soviet system had been raised and moulded by that system, here decorated by Brezhnev on his way to the top. And he never stopped believing in it. When he took office in 1985, his policies of glasnost and perestroika, openness and reform, were designed to save the Soviet Union, not destroy it. A nation plagued by empty shelves and an industrial base stuck in the 50s would never, he feared, be able to compete with a technologically advancing West. Margaret Thatcher was one of the first to see in him a Soviet leader of a different breed. "This is a man I can do business with," she famously declared, and with her encouragement, US President Ronald Reagan flew to Geneva for the first summit. The two men hit it off, and for the first time since 1945, there seemed a chance to put the nuclear arms race into reverse. Within a year, they were meeting again in Reykjavik with a proposal on the table for a zero option, the abolition of all ballistic missiles within 10 years.
Are you optimistic, Mr. President?
I'm always optimistic.
That proved too much, but by 1987 they had done a deal to abolish all intermediate-range nuclear weapons in Europe. After decades of Cold War paralysis, the speed of progress was dizzying.
Because he was determined to do it. He'd got fed up with the old system, Brezhnev and so on, and he thought that it was leading Russia into complete cul-de-sac. And so he wanted to change a great deal. And what's more, he actually persuaded the army and the KGB and so on to cooperate with him and cooperate with us, therefore.
But the people of Eastern Europe and Western leaders wanted more.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
But not even Ronald Reagan would have thought that within 4 years of taking office, Mikhail Gorbachev would allow Berliners, East and West, to do just that. The rest of Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe soon followed, some, like Germany and Poland, peacefully, others, like Romania, after bloody revolution. But it was when the Soviet Union itself began to disintegrate that Moscow's KGB and military hierarchy tried to call a halt. With Gorbachev on holiday in August 1991, tanks took to the streets of Moscow to depose the president. But the taste for reform was too strong to be extinguished so easily. Led by the defiance of Boris Yeltsin, the coup plotters were driven from the streets and Gorbachev brought back in triumph. He didn't realize it then, but the Soviet Union he flew back to was already dead. A few months of failed attempts to re-establish his authority ended on Christmas Day 1991 with the lowering of the red flag above the Kremlin for the final time. In retirement, he was that prophet who found honor everywhere except his own land. While the world feted him at a gala 80th birthday party in the Albert Hall, a successor, Vladimir Putin, was describing the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Mikhail Gorbachev liberated millions and brought West and East together in Europe after 45 years of nuclear brinkmanship. That friendship may be fraying now, but it remains a magnificent legacy.
Mikhail Gorbachev, who died, sadly, in Moscow today. Now, let's go to our correspondent, Robert Moore, who is in Washington. You've reported, obviously, extensively from both Moscow and Washington. Indeed, I remember you arriving in Moscow in 1988. I'm assuming, you know, Cold War at its height. When you did arrive in Moscow as a very young correspondent, you couldn't really have imagined what subsequently happened. So what's your own assessment of that period and of the impact of the man and his legacy?
I think Tom simply is a seismic figure in Soviet and in Russian history. When I arrived in Russia, you know, and the Soviet Union, it was going through just extraordinary economic dislocation, and I witnessed some of the transformation and how Mikhail Gorbachev tried to ensure it was a peaceful transition away from empire and not a violent implosion. Two words, of course, became ever associated with Mikhail Gorbachev, glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, which translates as sort of restructuring. And he was the great reformer of a system that was sort of built on totalitarianism, on central economic control, and on empire. In the end, of course, he failed. You know, he was replaced by Boris Yeltsin, which in turn led to those rapacious years of the oligarchs. He failed because there was violence on the fringes of the Soviet Union as well, particularly in Chechnya and the Caucasus. And he failed too because ultimately, after Boris Yeltsin, we returned to the idea of a new czar in the form and the shape of Vladimir Putin. And one of the great ironies of the timing of Mikhail Gorbachev's death is surely that it takes place as Russia once more has the forces of empire and totalitarianism coursing through his veins. But for me, I think my primary memory, in a way, of Gorbachev is his decency, his kind of reformist ambition, how he was a Russian in the very best sense of the word. He wanted deeply and profoundly Russia to be at peace with itself and the rest of the world.
Well, Robert, as we've discussed, this has only been emerging in the last half an hour or so, and yet he was this huge global figure. What reaction have we had so far?
Well, from the White House, nothing at all yet. I think, you know, many sort of capitals around the world will be trying to take stock of Gorbachev's legacy, but certainly I think people will be asking, you know, whether, you know, they're asking the big historical questions tonight, whether the Soviet Union was ever truly reformable, whether it was always inevitable that a new sort of strongman, a new czar, if you like, would come to the helm of Russian politics, as indeed it has proved to be the case with Vladimir Putin. I think overall in the Western world, Tom, there will be a sense of sorrow, but also of deep admiration for Gorbachev's reformist instincts.
Robert, can I just ask you one more question, a sort of personal assessment question again? You and I have so often debated, history students write essays about how, you know, much great men and women do or do not influence history. Do you think that the Soviet Union was destined to collapse in the way that it did, one way or another? Or do you think Mikhail Gorbachev will go down in history as somebody who individually had a profound effect on the era in which he lived?
I think if ever there's a case for the sort of great man or great woman of history, the great individual of history, I think Gorbachev speaks to it. I think he had decency at a time when the Soviet Union was literally falling apart, when parts of the empire were just spiraling out of control. And I think that sense of decency gave Russians a sense of hope. It also gave the West a sense of hope, perhaps a hope that has now been betrayed, that Russia could be reformed, could become once more part of sort of the Western world. It is a deep irony and a tragic irony that this heroic figure of Gorbachev dies just as Russia is going through some of its very darkest hours.
We couldn't end tonight's programme without returning to the death of one of the greatest figures of the late 20th century. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, has died at the age of 91 after what a hospital in Moscow called a long illness. He was a reformer after decades of communist totalitarianism who formed an unlikely partnership, a friendship even, with US President Ronald Reagan as they brought 4 decades of Cold War to an end. He was the leader Margaret Thatcher said famously she could do business with, as he sought to reform the Eastern Bloc, reforms which, against his wishes, led to the breakup of the Soviet Union. In later life, he remained a friend of the West. He always said he knew that initiating reforms was risky, but he appeared to have no regrets. As Robert said earlier in the programme, a shining example of how great men and women can change the world.
This morning's papers, starting off with The Guardian, which carries a front page picture of former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. He's died at the age of 91. Mr. Gorbachev is also pictured on the front page of The Telegraph. The Times, too, shows him on the front page, describing how his reforms in the former Soviet Union led to freedom across Eastern Europe. London's Metro has this headline: "World mourns a true man of peace."